we look at the different personalities, can we see that the influence would be profoundly different? And I end on this one. Now, I don't need to explain this. I'm entirely sure that depending what success represents for you, it will take you on a profoundly different path. And I think that it's long been said, for example, relative to children and social media, television, and the like, that we need to be cautious about what they're exposed to. Why? Because it has an influence. But I pose the same point to you, that success can so often be misinterpreted. Donald Trump can claim the success of being a US president. Does that represent success for me? Hell no. So I share that with you, and I say again, this needs to become a much more conscious element of our pursuit of success. I think in many cases for us, we need to broaden and deepen our what represents success beyond those obvious factors. A key question, if we're looking at success, is a good question to ask is, what factors lead to success? Remember, we're still looking at it personally here. And here I'd like to launch we've only got these 2 polls. And here I am asking you personally, what do you think is the secret of success? And you can see there's 6 choices. And in many of these cases, they really are very different. Let me just qualify that last choice of being prepared to do whatever it takes. I am meaning that in the negative. I don't mean the hard work, which I've got right at the top of that list. I mean being prepared to do whatever it takes, even if it's cutting corners or doing something that's unethical or illegal. I mean it in quite a negative sense, but it didn't allow for such long text to be included there. So again, your personal view on what do you think those factors are that we would write down as the secret of success? Like there's some magic answer, but there are certainly factors that are pertinent.
Thanks, Cynthia. I think everyone's completing very nicely there. And I mean, there's a really nice variety of answers.
Yes. And remember, again, I know we can get very technical about how we word these questions. What do you think the secret of success is can apply to yourself or in a broader sense? You can say, look, for me, I personally would rely on ethics, integrity, and trust. But if I look around me, what I'm seeing, but I'm overcomplicating the question. Sarah, I think when you want to end that. Excellent. So here an interesting spread, and actually in some cases quite balanced. So there are 2 factors, perseverance, ethics, integrity, and trust, as really being the key factors for you that are pertinent to success. And then we've also got resilience at quite a good follow-up score. And then we've got 1 person each who went with contacts, knowing the right people. And, if you're in the tenderpreneur space, I know that I'm not speaking to that group. I always say by definition, if you're attending an Ethics Practitioners Association webinar, I think we can make some assumptions there. And we've got 1 vote there for hard work. But if we look at it, I mean, that's a wonderful response that, again, we would perhaps expect from this group. I pause on the 1 top score of ethics, integrity, and trust. And here I just want to share a comment that I have made in previous webinars, that, and this relates to the huge extent of corruption in our country. And honestly, every time you look, it's another entity in, somewhere else that now, in the Eastern Cape, there's more COVID-related corruption that has been uncovered. But really, there's almost a story a day. And I have posed the question quite often that if we're looking at ethics, integrity, and trust, as the secret of success, as the factors that would drive success, there would be many who say, not connecting the dots. But when I started with, can we remember the scope and scale of corruption? The question I've often posed is, what is a consequence of having such broad-spread corruption? And one of the consequences is, can you see, it has elevated the value of ethics. It has elevated the value of integrity, that we're looking around us saying, oh my goodness. But when we engage with people, whether personally, whether as service providers, whether as colleagues, the people we would like to engage with, the people we would like to give our business to, the people we'd like to be friends with, would be those who represent ethics, integrity, who really warrant our trust. So the irony, as I've always shared, is that one of the unintended positive consequences of this huge amount of corruption is it has made the value of ethics far, far greater, because we're almost looking at it as something that is quite scarce. So an interesting response there. Thank you very much. So again, I've stressed this point. It makes a difference, as I said, not only how you define success, but the people and the factors that influence that success make a difference. Why? Because it shapes your goals and your conduct on that particular chosen path to success. And I do rather like this. Again, it comes back to my Alice in Wonderland thing. The clarity of goals means we can have clarity of plans and clarity of action. And that would be a fundamental underpinning for success. And of course, the opposite is that we sit there with an apparent dilemma, not the right word, of course, to look at a path that is or isn't ethical. And so that for me is a core element of this. But I think that this question is very pertinent at a personal level. What's the cost of success? And you can phrase that differently and say, what price are you prepared to pay for success? And again, a really core question. I would hope that it's a question you'll take away with you and consider. I often find that over the festive season, where most of us will have a little bit of downtime, there are those couple of questions that you can just take with you. Have you defined success clearly enough? Does it encompass just having or being? And what price are you prepared to pay for success? And here Aldous Huxley, made one of the wonderful comments that were made around the price of success. But when we look at success at any cost, of course we've seen that. We've probably in our time worked with people who've pursued that. But what I'd like to share with you is a wonderful poem in this regard, and I'm going to read it to you just for emphasis. As you can see, it's a poem called I Have Arrived. I've not seen the plays in town, only the computer printouts. I've not read the latest books, only the Wall Street Journal. I've not heard the birds sing this year, only the ringing of phones. I've not taken a walk anywhere, but from the parking lot to my office. I've not shared a feeling in years, but my thoughts are known to all. I had not listened to my own needs, but what I want I get. I have not shed a tear in ages. I have arrived. Is this where I was going? And so I share that with you because I think the pursuit of success can be a very unrelenting treadmill that, for want of pausing around these important questions, I think we can land up with, I have arrived. And is this where I was going? Is this where I wanted to be? Moving on now, I'd like to share a little comment around ethics and organizational success, and then time permitting, which we should have, I'd like to share two little case studies with you that I think are interesting around how we perceive success. Again, same point applies organizationally as individually. How success is defined is crucial. And often there are huge goals that would imply that achieving that goal constitutes success. But dimensions of organizational success, I've included 7 here. And again, we could nuance those if we were looking at a non-profit organization. Here you can see much of this is looking at profitability, market share, share price. But those factors you will obviously recognize fit very solidly into a private sector organization. But when we're looking at, is it a dimension of organizational success if we grow and develop and empower employees? What about good service levels? If we're looking at a public sector entity, good service levels would mean an enormous amount. I'll not mention electricity, but whether it's water or schooling or the like. If that were defined as an organizational success criteria, that would be extraordinary. Of course, given an ESG focus, are we looking at impacting society positively or impacting the environment positively? Are we looking at those as success criteria? So as I say, there are the obvious ones, but we define organizational goals, I say again, which by definition equate to success. But how broadly are we looking at that? And, I'm sure that if we read the wording around many public sector entities in our country, good service delivery would be there. Of course, actually achieving it is the success, not defining it. But I think we all appreciate that distinction. Again, within in the organizational space, who our role models are, who influences our view of success makes a huge difference. Let me be clear here, I'm picking out, some baddies in this regard. Were they influential? Of course they were, because they achieved an enormous, financially achieved an enormous amount. But if these people were role models, the influence, again, I stress the point, the influence would be profoundly different. And again, I would encourage this to almost be a conscious part of it within our organization. We develop role models. Are we clear that when we're looking at the gift of the givers, or we're looking at Oak Bay, the influence, depending who we hold in high esteem as regards success, the influence would be profoundly different. And hence, this is a factor that we should be managing consciously, even in our organizations. It's also worth, in terms of this topic, looking at the success criteria that would be applicable to employees within an organization. And here again, there's an important message here, is that classically promotions, rewards, and remuneration of all kinds, as well as recognition, are the classic factors that are used in an organization. But the question we need to have answered when we designed these was, are these used to promote results? Are they used to promote ethics? Or are they used to promote ethical results? And again, that difference of results at any cost, I'm sure you would have experienced it, but that really is a factor. And the criteria that inform our performance management systems and our reward criteria, of course, influence that. We are spelling out how to achieve success within the organization. And what is the message that structure is sharing? And here to really emphasize the point, that whether it's rewards, remuneration, promotions, recognition, how it's both structured and how it's implemented will directly shape how success is perceived. And let's be clear, there's a follow-on. that once we've given out that message, this is how success is perceived, can we see that what follows is it will shape the behavior in pursuit of success, and the people who are successful, it will define them as role models. So a deceptively simple comment, but please let's be clear, if we're talking about success, this is having a huge impact, and that impact within the organization should be managed consciously. Let me, of course, add the other point that success at the moment, when we're in a wobbly economy, to put it politely, when we're looking at increasing interest rates, when we're looking at decreased supply of electricity, there are so many factors that are putting huge pressure on people in the workplace, and obviously those who are not employed. Inflation, you understand the picture. Can you see that those we're looking at in this instance, those who are employed, will need to and want to pursue success even more so in a tough space, because for many, trying to make ends meet is becoming increasingly difficult. And in our country, in many cases, we're looking at the people who are employed having to deal with an increasing number of dependents who are not employed, with the scary unemployment numbers we have. So pursuing success becomes almost a primary path within the workplace to trying to meet one's needs and support those around you. And this will shape that. Team support that is illustrated not around working together and recognizing those who have supported you along the way. So again, an important dimension that I share with you in terms of your thinking of how success is managed relative to ethics within the organization. And here I use this term, I grant you the common term is a self-made man. I was tempted to make it more gender friendly, but I respected the long-standing term. And this, interestingly, as you can see, the graphic is a wonderful sculpture by an American artist. And she sculpted a man who is really cutting himself out of a block of stone to shape his world and his future. And part of the thinking that when we're looking at it in the organizational sense, and perhaps to an extent in the personal sense as well, we fall into this view of the self-made man. Now, I don't know what you're thinking, you know, that gives rise to lots of thoughts for me. But can we in an organizational sense just pause on this point and recognize that the success of any organization is extremely unlikely to rest on one so-called self-made man, that the contribution of many others would be absolutely core. So that fallacy of the self-made man is, I think we need to bring that to bear, not fall into that trap of that very old saying. Let me tell you, this is a saying that comes out, I'm trying to remember the date exactly, very late 1800s, like 1896, and it was made in an American political structure. And at the time of coining this phrase, it was in fact used in a positive sense to contrast people, they were looking at men who had inherited great wealth and therefore were successful by virtue of achievements of prior generations. And what it originally looked at was someone who had worked and on their own and by their own efforts had been successful. But I think we have expanded this beyond that contrast of inherited wealth and earned wealth. We can fall into that trap of the singular power of individuals. And here I'd like to pause and look at two case studies that I think are very interesting. Sarah, I'm assuming there are no questions or comments at this stage.
No, Cynthia, you're all good for the moment.
Good. So in terms of case studies, the first one I'd like to look at, and this is of Jeremy Clarkson, whom I'm sure you'll all remember was the lead presenter of Top Gear on the BBC. And let me tell you that he was head of that program. He led that program in the BBC from October 2002 to March 2015. And I want to share a couple of details around this. And the question I'm posing as a practical case study is, does success override ethics? Now, we haven't quite looked at that point, but it is made extremely well in this. And let me tell you, I have used this. I wrote this case study myself at the time, and I have used it very successfully as a case study. And you'll see that I've included enough detail here. So when I say that you know, one of the headlines that Jeremy Clarkson was Britain's most entertaining scandal, I mean, he was guilty over those years, not once or twice. He was guilty repeatedly of the most unacceptable conduct, of the most unacceptable speech. And much of it was hugely discriminatory. You know, among his, and I say really numerous obnoxious comments, you know, look at that second one. I don't understand bus lanes. Why do poor people have to get to places quicker than I do? Now, I'm quoting, I certainly don't intend to offend you, but I'm quoting among a huge list of obnoxious comments that Jeremy Clarkson has made. You know, as to the third one, I'm not even going to read it aloud. So, I mean, it's not simply obnoxious. It's not simply crass. It moves into deeply, deeply discriminatory territory. When we look at this question of success versus ethics, and I'm posing the question, what would you have done relative to Jeremy Clarkson and at what stage? Here, let me tell you that what finally transpired is there were dozens of incidents, as I say, in different countries at different stages. And let me just pause before I share the final incident that proved to, that ended that relationship, is that the Top Gear program was extraordinarily successful on the BBC. It reportedly earned the BBC an annual revenue of about 150 million pounds. Now, remember, that's back then, so that was a while. And it was watched on average by 350 million people worldwide. And as I say, remember, this is 2002 to 2015, so it's not that current. I mean, this was a huge success. But having said that, while in March 2015, while they were filming on location, Jeremy Clarkson was irritated by one of the producers of the program. And in this case, actually, it turned into physical violence and he punched the guy. Anyway, that resulted in him being suspended, and they ran a disciplinary process. And I mean, which was all done, you know, very carefully. There was huge support of people signing a petition to save his job. But in the end, it was agreed that they would part company. There's a wonderful twist in this tale around Jeremy Clarkson reading what was a very highly paid job at the BBC. But here's the interesting point around success versus ethics. So Jeremy Clarkson has over all these years run this most successful, lucrative program for the BBC. But it has had all these scandals that have been brushed under the carpet, brushed aside as just a joke, meant in jest. You can imagine all the various one-liners. But if we look at this, what would you have done? And I share this from 4 perspectives, because this is part of the depth of how we need to look at this. If you were the main shareholder of the BBC, and as such, you should be focused on its reputation and its profitability, what would you have done, and at what stage? If you were the BBC HR director in charge of ethics and compliance, what would you have done? And would those decisions and actions have been the same? What about if you were a governance activist or an ethics activist focused on governance in major corporations? And quite a different perspective, what about if you were head of the Jeremy Clarkson fan club? And, you know, he's the epitome of, so to speak, the charming rogue. But in calling him a charming rogue, what we do is we diminish the negative impact of hugely discriminatory comments. And so again, I'd welcome your comments if you have any comments here. But can you see that when we act and what we act relative to is hugely important? And in this case, I would certainly argue that success totally trumped ethics for the BBC until finally I don't even think it was cumulative. Finally, there was real physical action attached to the poor behavior, and for some reason they felt they couldn't ignore that one, and he was finally dismissed, but not without, as I said, a huge amount of support of people signing a petition to save his job. If you want, the irony of all of this is that after being fired from the BBC, you know, of course, that he was then engaged by Amazon Video to make the grand tour. I mean, this is not something I necessarily watch, as you might imagine. And if you, I mean, the Top Gear had made Jeremy Clarkson and his fellow presenters, you know, very, very wealthy. I don't mean slightly, but you know that when they took on that show with Amazon Video, do you know that it was at 10 times what he was paid by the BBC? So, I mean, to say that Jeremy Clarkson came out of this smiling is an understatement. But I look at someone, and he might be, you know, for many of you, you know, I mean, ran a wonderful show, so entertaining. But I put this to you for consideration of saying, in my opinion, success did trump ethics for a very long time. A more current example, and you can see I've put here a success story with a very intended question mark next to it. And if you don't know it, the most successful Chinese fast fashion, it's an e-store, of course, is, I originally pronounced the Shine. In fact, it's pronounced Shein. And there was I looked at it, in fact, was introduced to it. I'm mortified to say, because a friend of mine has bought from them. But having heard about it, I really looked into it. There's an excellent Wired article on it. But if you don't know Shein, they don't have a normal retail outlet. But when I say they are successful, the company claims 28% of the US fast fashion market. Now, you can imagine the size of that market. That's a huge slice. And part of the challenge when we're looking at trying to quantify the success of Shein, the author of this article makes such a valid point of saying you can't compare them to Zara. They should rather be compared to Amazon. Now, this is a very large organization, as we well know. So their success is in terms of producing and supplying goods and distributing goods is not in question. In terms of what it's offering, it has an enormous choice. And here, daily, its website has 6,000 new styles. If you compare those figures, it goes into figures for Zara, for H&M. I mean, at the top end, we're in high hundreds per day at the top end, but in many cases, those figures are only per month. So, I mean, it is spewing out new products, clothing, of course, at an unprecedented rate. And let me tell you, really low prices, that price-wise, you can see the comment here, Shein is undercutting a deli sandwich. I do, as I said, have a girlfriend who's bought from them. Let me tell you, she was wearing a black top, very much a sort of Versace design on it. It looked very nice. And it cost, I mean, for nothing. It was extraordinarily inexpensive. Here's the key question, where I start with a success story. And I use this just as a case study for us to be alert about success in relation to ethics. Can such cheap clothing be ethical? And here, let me pause on that. I had the opportunity to do quite an in-depth study on supply chains. And in the clothing industry, you would, of course, be aware of the many challenges in the clothing industry where the workers, not in the main suppliers, but as we move down that chain of suppliers, we're moving into what are called shadow factories. Is there child labor? Absolutely. Is there virtually slave labor? Absolutely. And the study I did was on modern slavery. And I can tell you the clothing industry in their supply chain is absolutely one of the culprits. But you can think back to Rana Plaza, that disaster in Bangladesh. There are so many examples. So I posed a question to you. At all obvious levels, Shein is hugely successful. Can such cheap clothing be ethical? And here I add another question. Given the opportunity, would you invest in the company? Now, we can look at investments. I think the investment has moved to Process, and I've suddenly gone blank on the, is the company Tencent? Someone please help me. What's the Chinese company that Process is invested in? I think it's Tencent. And I mean, they have done extraordinarily well out of holding a share in that company. So given an opportunity, would you invest in Shein? And here, I think that, again, I would call into question that what are you pursuing? What is the success you were pursuing? And does that align with ethics? Or would they, in this case, be mutually exclusive? And here's the tough question. I'm not asking you to admit. As I say, I have one friend. I tried to be kind about it. And to say to her, I want you to think about this. Can the operation possibly be ethical? And they, of course, are claiming it's perfectly ethical, but can it be? And we're talking about this being distributed all around the world, and by the way, very promptly too. So I pose these questions because I think increasingly we should be looking at success without separating ethics from it. In terms of ethics and integrity being compatible with success, there's quite an extraordinary little video clip that I'd like to share with you in conclusion. And and I'll share the words. I've typed them up for you afterwards. But what I think is noteworthy about this is not only that it is scripted around integrity and around the importance of integrity relative to success. But what I think is so very pertinent about this is, as you can see, what I'm about to share is a Hugo Boss ad. And it's not that current. It's now, Sarah, I think it's probably a couple of years old now. But to find a global brand, let me repeat, of course, we're still in the clothing industry, among others, of course. I mean, Hugo Boss does much more than clothing. But here we're in a major brand that is associating itself so closely with integrity. So let me share this wonderful little video clip with you.
Success without integrity means nothing. Your belongings don't make you a better man. Your behavior does. Integrity is how you behave when there's nothing to be gained. We make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give. Choose to strive for more, for better. Every hour of every day, be the man of today. Boss Bottled.
And so these are the words which I think carry such weight. And I think that we can add a question mark behind it. Does success without integrity mean nothing? And I think that that is a question to answer for ourselves and to answer within our organizations. And I've juxtaposed success and ethics in many different perspectives and from a number of different angles with some really core questions. But I think that they capture this so very well, that when we look at the being and the having, your belongings don't make you a better man, but your behavior certainly does. And as I say, I think I'll leave you to read this. I have again been tempted to make this gender neutral, but that would be me changing their text. But I think that this is a sound message for all of us to reflect on. So on that note, can I thank you very much for joining us and being part of this webinar. Sarah, as always, thank you for having the background, and Stefan, thank you for your introduction if you'd like to close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for a very insightful perspective on the topic. Something I personally took out of the presentation is some introspection into what success means for me, and to define the path towards that. Thank you very much for that. I want to close off by thanking our attendees for joining us today. I think by this time next week, most of us will be finishing off for the year and getting ready to have a well-deserved rest. Thank you to our members for your support during the year. We owe you a huge part of the EPA's success. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to doing even more in 2023. So to those of you who will be traveling, please be safe. Watch out on the roads. It's really a silly season out there. So we hope everyone has a blessed and peaceful festive season. And thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.